World leaders marched with millions of French people yesterday to show solidarity in the wake of last week's terrorist attacks in Paris. Intelligence officials continue to piece together whether the three gunmen acted in isolation or on behalf of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or some other terror group. The attacks renew questions about the challenges nations face in identifying terrorist threats and preventing them. UC San Diego economics professor Ellie Berman, author of Radical, Religious, and Violent: The New Economics of Terrorism, is here, along with Deepak Gupta, San Diego State's distinguished political science professor. Professor Berman, one of law enforcement's biggest fears is people going abroad to receive terrorist training and returning to attack the homeland. Given the attacks last week in Paris, can the West expect more such attacks?
Oh, absolutely. Absent much more aggressive security response, much better monitoring of ex-jihadists, then yes, this is going to happen and it's going to happen again. I mean, I think what's worth stressing here is there's been a pattern. There was Toulouse, there was the Jewish Museum in Brussels, there was the attack on the Canadian Parliament, there was the Boston Marathon bombing. What's common to all of these is homegrown terrorists who went and trained somewhere, as far as we can tell, and came back with a skill level that allowed them to do things that were really quite audacious. The Boston Marathon bombing attack and the Charlie Hebdo attack are cases in which a well-defended target was nevertheless successfully attacked. This means that our law enforcement, our counterterrorism, really has to up their game, especially in Europe.
Professor Gupta, this fall, FBI Director James Comey was in San Diego, and he talked about the danger of would-be attackers acting alone. Here's what he said.
Thanks to the proliferation of material on the internet, someone no longer needs to be directed by Al-Qaeda or one of its progeny, but instead can be self-directed, inspired, and trained in a way that's very, very difficult for us to see.
So, Professor Gupta, given that state of affairs, how does law enforcement even begin to identify the threat?
It is very difficult indeed, because these self-radicalized people, which in the terrorism parlance are called the lone wolves. And lone wolves, they are motivated by their own inner callings. And suddenly, they get military training from the internet, little bit of training, or they actually go over to Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan. They come back radicalized and then suddenly decide to attack. Now, those are very difficult targets to approach from the FBI's perspective. Little bit easier are those who are like 3, 4, or 5 people when they form what they're called the Fedayeen group. That means they're like the Mumbai attackers or the Canadian Parliament attackers. When they go out and they know that they may be killed, and sometimes they are actually killed. And those are but since they are people, they are talking to each other, they're a little bit easier to detect.
Professor Berman, we keep on hearing that from intelligence officials that Al-Qaeda has shrunk, but simultaneously we have ISIS now and the proliferation of other terrorist groups. Is there a political solution in addition to a military one?
In our in our conflict with Al-Qaeda or with ISIS?
With ISIS and other groups.
Yeah, I think, hotspot by hotspot, in the long run, of course, there's a political solution. In Syria, in Lebanon, eventually, in Somalia, in Yemen, Pakistan, Afghanistan. Each of these things could be solved in isolation, but in the meantime, and this could be generational, there's going to be a threat to people that live in the West. And we're going to have to be able to defend against it, which means we're going to have to be able to keep track of individuals that rotate through those hotspots and get themselves trained.
Professor Gupta, following the Parisian attacks, Islamic leaders all over the world came out in full force to condemn them. What's the purpose of this condemnation?
The purpose of the condemnation is to show a unity of purpose, a united front against political extremism by these Islamist groups. It included people from all over the world, including the Islamic world. Mahmoud Abbas was there. And all of these, the presence of all of these people tell the extremists that we don't approve of what you're doing, and it's not popular.
Professor Berman, journalist Ron Suskind spoke with me recently, and he said the purpose of attacks on the West is to narrow our civil liberties. Here's more of what he said.
They want us to show the world that they're brittle, that they're matters of convenience, that when we feel fear, they'll vanish. That's the idea. It's to instill terror and to show ultimately that the United States and the West is not true to its oaths. That's key. It's a dynamic we're in now, a hearts and minds struggle.
Very quickly, is there a way for the West to combat terror without trampling on our civil liberties?
Well, there's a balance, but I don't think the tension is what is the tension that people think it is. In the following sense, civil liberties are valuable to us. They're much more valuable to us than any of this in any case. But it's also true that to the extent that a community feels isolated, and there are over 5 million Muslims in France, right? To an extent that a community feels isolated, then it might not want to cooperate with the authorities when it identifies a youth at risk. In the long run, what you really want to do is make it very, very hard for recruiters to identify kids that think it's their calling to go off and fight in Syria in the name of some cause. What you want is for the principal to report that person so they can go have a chat with him and maybe disabuse them of that notion that they could be a hero in Syria and then perhaps come home and become a threat in France.
And we've got to wrap it there. Professor Berman, Professor Gupta, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thank you.
You're welcome.